Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we're here with a special guest I'm very excited to have with us, Angela Arnett Garner, a historian and indigenous rights activist from Lincoln County. So, Angela, thanks for joining us. How you doing?
I'm doing fine, and thanks for having me. I'm glad to be on here.
Well, I'm glad to have you. Before we get started, I always like to ask people their Kentucky connection. So, what's your Kentucky connection?
Well, so I'm a lifelong Kentuckian, and I was born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky, and then I relocated to Lincoln County 15 years ago in 2007, and I've been living here ever since. And I love it. I love it here. Both my parents were from Casey County.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm a little biased, but I like Lincoln County as well. But we got a good topic here. We're going to talk about the Cherokee in Kentucky, the role they had, some history about them, and some involvement that you've had. If you want to start off by just getting into some of the involvement you've had with Cherokee in Kentucky, I won't spoil anything, but there's something in Stanford that's very important to you and to, I hope, the whole state. But tell us a little bit about that.
Well, so when I first moved here back in 2007, I noticed that there was a lot of different historical markers in the area, but none that specifically talked about Native American history alone. And so I set about to change that, and I got in touch with some local authorities. And discussed, how I could go about getting a historical marker placed somewhere in Stanford. And so I met with former Mayor Eddie Carter, and he helped me because he had been through that process a couple of times before with the marker program at the Kentucky Historical Society, and so he knew how best to go about doing that. And I researched and wrote the historical marker called Cherokees in Kentucky, that's located on historic Main Street on the courthouse lawn. And it's a two-part marker. On one side discusses Chief Doublehead, and the other side discusses the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals. And so we dedicated the marker on October the 19th, 2013. And I really didn't realize at the time that there would be a special unveiling ceremony. So when we completed the funding, somebody came up to me, at the Lincoln County Historical Society meeting, and they said, "You do realize that you're going to have to organize an unveiling ceremony?" And I said, "No, I didn't. I didn't realize that at all." And so they mentioned, you might want to get maybe a flute player from Lexington, or someplace around here might have a flute player. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that, if I really went big and pulled in, recruited somebody with a lot of name recognition, that it would call a lot of attention to this issue, that there is a proud Native American heritage, a really unique history here and culture in the state of Kentucky that a lot of people, are not aware of. Mm-hmm. So I just cold called two-time Grammy winner Rita Coolidge's agent out in California. And she seemed rather surprised that I was calling her. And I told her, who I was, and that I had researched and written an official Kentucky historical marker called Cherokees in Kentucky, and that it would be unveiled. And I asked, would Rita Coolidge consider unveiling the marker with me? And she actually laughed in the phone. She said, "I have no idea." She said, Rita Coolidge has never been asked this before. And I'll just have to ask her, because I have no idea. And so a few days later, the phone rang, and it was her agent, Nellie. And she said, Rita wants to come out and do it. And so it really shocked a lot. I think a lot of people in Stanford. I was told actually one time, you are crazy if you think that Rita Coolidge is going to come to a little town like Stanford. And I
Yeah.
said, no, no, no. She she loves the history of this area. She
Uh-huh.
loves, she wants to be a part of this. No, no, no. You don't know what you're talking about. You're crazy. And so these people, they were really shocked when she actually uh, arrived in Stanford, and there she was. And so it was just
Mhm.
a beautiful event there on the courthouse lawn, and she sang "Amazing Grace" in Cherokee. And
Oh,
to my
cool.
knowledge, I think that's still on YouTube if people want to pull it
Okay.
up and see that. Yeah. And we had some, really nice speakers and a local officials that spoke, and it was just a beautiful service. And I got to spend the weekend with Rita Coolidge, and
Well, that's pretty cool, but it never hurts to ask. You know, uh, it can work out from time to time for sure. Well, that's pretty cool. Also, that's not where it ended, right? You.
absolutely. So after the marker was unveiled, then
Mhm.
that caught the attention of former Governor Steve Beshear, who uh, appointed me to the Kentucky Native American Heritage Commission. So I served a term with them, and during that term of service, somebody asked, um, you know, that they've been trying to get Indigenous Peoples Day, a proclamation passed in the state of Kentucky, to no avail. Did anyone in the room know of a town anywhere in the state of Kentucky that would, um, you know, uh, think about passing a
Mhm.
proclamation for the city council to review the matter? And it was the first time that the city council reviewed it. Um, it was a sort of a heated discussion, and so there were people on both sides of the issue that were very strong-minded, and so one of the city council members voted to table it. But then the matter was brought back then on September the 19th, 2017, and they voted on it, and it was almost unanimous. Only one person voted against it.
Well, that's good.
So that Stanford City Council voted then for the first Indigenous Peoples Day proclamation in Kentucky history.
Wow. Well, that's another good thing about Lincoln County. Another good thing to hang the hat on. Um, which you talked about at the beginning, so many markers that there are in Lincoln County, and that there are a lot of historical markers in and around Stanford and Lincoln County as a whole. But it's very true. It's one of those markers that the Cherokees in Kentucky. I've read that one many times, walking by the courthouse many times. I'm like, man, that's such a cool sign. You don't see many of those around.
Thank you.
uh, it didn't. Whenever you had reached out and got in touch, I was like, man, it's a pretty cool thing. It's kind of like I read this Kentucky Encyclopedia all the time, and meeting somebody who's written in that, it's pretty cool to have you on the show and to well just the process. That's a different process you don't always get to talk about, but it's very good. It's very unique. Another good unique thing about historical Stanford, I guess, if we want to make that plug. Well, anything else though on that end of things? Were you ready to get into some Cherokee history?
I'm ready to talk about history. Yeah.
um, yeah, I took some notes down, and of course, as you get into this, I've always been a big student or want to learn more about the indigenous people here in Kentucky. And we think about, I've heard the term, modern Native Americans when you think of, Shawnee and the Cherokee, and you can go the Yuchi, the Chickasaw. There's many different tribes, of course, but whenever there's even people before that there's just not as much known about, and hopefully at some point we can get us some archaeologists on here to talk about those as well. But you kind of got to go with the history that you got, or that you can that you have resources for. um, but anyway, with all that, the things, I just got a few facts, some kind of basic stuff about the Cherokee and their culture, and how they kind of lived and operated here in Kentucky, and so forth. And of course, there's always those misconceptions we'll have to wade through, and do our best as far as those go. So the Cherokee were a Iroquoian lineage. Their main area, and not limited to, would have been southern Appalachian region, more kind of the southern central, or the south central eastern parts of Kentucky. They were woodland Mississippian cultures. They lived on small river villages and towns. The men were hunter gatherers. The women were cultivated the crops, and so forth. A different, but common culture among Native Americans. I'd say the biggest misconception that people have, of course, they think of Native Americans, they think of teepees. That was not the case for Cherokee. They lived in log dwellings, public houses, roofed with bark. These are not the stereotypical teepees that people think about.
Yeah, that's right.
A lot of, well, it's a lot of people think that's the typical, but not the case, and not the case for many tribes. Those kind of things were kind of, how, I don't want to say emblazoned, but more put forth in the, would it be the 50s, the 60s, when they're in the Western movies and all that kind of stuff, when those things were came out. Which I don't never watched a lot of Westerns, but
No, I don't either.
the Cherokee society was what you would call matrilineal. Did I say that right?
Yeah,
Matrilineal.
matrilineal.
Well, can you explain that a little better? Matrilineal. How that all works?
Well, they traced their heritage through the mother's side of their family. In other words, the mother had a lot more um, voice in society, um, than is in modern society, really.
Yeah, and like so, and two, like the other part of that would be that, like, so you lived with your mother's family, and like the uncles and so forth, the mother's brothers, they served as that primary role for the youth. You get the saying, it takes a village to raise a child, and that was literally how it worked with the native Cherokee culture. Is they came together to uh, raise the kids, and so forth. The village life was kind of ruled by the town council, which was women and men would debate the issues till a consensus was reached. A few other things. So it is estimated that there would have been around 250,000 Cherokee in the southeastern United States in 16 well before 1650.
Hmm.
In six, which is a lot. I mean, you think about a 250,000. That's quite a bit. I mean, I guess if I'm thinking of, like, that's about the size of Lexington, 250,000,
Yeah,
maybe a little less, but the number I'm going to tell you here in a minute is really going to be like, oh my goodness. But in 1650, when Europeans brought disease and stuff over, the population dwindled down to like 25,000,
yeah,
which is just, I mean,
yeah.
devastating. I mean, to say the least. I mean,
Yeah, and then Native Americans didn't were exposed at that time to a lot of European diseases that they were not prepared for, didn't have the resistance for it, like smallpox, for instance, and that was really devastating, and then just the encountering the colonization of the continent, and the war and that ensued between Europeans and Native Americans. A lot of people don't realize that um, now a lot of people associate primarily North Carolina and Tennessee as the home of Cherokees. But
Hmm.
Cherokees actually inhabited most of the southeastern United States at one point.
Yeah.
And the only reason that North Carolina is more associated in modern times with the Cherokee is that um, the land at some point was donated. The Qualla Boundary Reservation was donated in December 1st, 1870, um, for um, the Cherokees to reside on that land, because they really didn't have any place to go. They just were sprinkled around in a large area, and that gave them the land that they needed.
And with this is another kind of definitely a debated topic when it comes to Kentucky and Native Americans. At the time of the first European explorers, there was no permanent Cherokee settlement, at least to the knowledge of them. Um, but I kind of think that does not mean that there wasn't. I would think that at some point there was definitely probably some sort of permanent Cherokee inhabitants in Kentucky. Um, whether or not European explorers found it or not, who knows. But I would think logically it wouldn't make it makes sense that there would be. Um,
Yeah,
I,
yeah, that's a common myth, and I'm not sure how that got started. That some people believe that it was only a hunting ground, but it was no more of a hunting ground than Tennessee or no, North Carolina or Georgia or any other place. It was that there's been a lot of different things found, you know, from tools to foodstuffs. Um,
mhm.
to beads, jewelry and all kinds of things that have been found and carbon dated. And they do know that Native Americans lived here off and on in Kentucky for at least 12,000 years.
Mhm.
They're different
And
tribes, not just the Cherokee,
yeah,
but
yeah.
the Chickasaw and the Choctaw and the Osage and Shawnee, of the Algonquin um, language speaking people. Yeah.
The Cherokee did obviously they obviously hunted frequently in Kentucky. That's definitely a case, or without a doubt. Excuse me. There is evidence, of course, of hunting camps and so forth around Cumberland River. Um, plenty of evidence of the Cherokee being in Kentucky. Um, and some interesting things, and then we can get into some other subjects here. But during the French and Indian War, the Cherokee fought on the side of the English, but that alliance, of course, did not last in 1760 when 29 Cherokee chiefs were massacred at Fort Prince George, and uh, that of course didn't set well. And there's a few other battles. I think that Cherokee took a fort for a while, and so forth. Um, but that brings us up to a topic that we can discuss a little more in depth is the in 1775, the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals, which is pretty interesting. We've talked about the Richard Henderson side of things, but let's talk a little bit more about that on the Cherokee side of things.
Well, so I believe that the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals actually is probably the surprisingly the least covered in a history class in
Hmm.
terms of Kentucky history or early American history for that matter. And it brought about so many vast changes as a result of that
Hmm.
treaty that people just don't realize, how it affected this area, how it affected the settlement of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And so Judge Richard G. Henderson of Virginia wanted to form a land company called the Transylvania Land Company in Kentucky that would be, basically a profit making business for him. But it went against the laws of the Virginia House of Burgess, which strictly prohibited contact or treaties being drawn up with Native Americans. And then, of course, you had, as a result of the French and Indian War, which was a silly law, but it was the treaty line, the proclamation line of 1763, which prohibited people from venturing past the proclamation line that was agreed to over in Great Britain. However, there was no way of enforcing that law.
Mm-hmm.
And the Virginia House of Burgesses went along with that treaty line of 1763. And but Richard G. Henderson had other ideas, and he didn't want to follow those laws of Virginia, and so he set about to make a treaty with the Native Americans, the Cherokees here, and he employed Daniel Boone to do so because he actually owed him money, and he knew that Daniel Boone was somewhat fluent, at least, with the Cherokee language and had spoken with the people. And so he arranged for the treaty to take place in March 17th, 1775, in what is now Elizabethton, Tennessee. And it was also called the Watauga Treaty, in addition to being called the more well-known name of the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals. And it sadly, the treaty included lands of most of present-day Kentucky in exchange for a wagon load of trade goods, which included, blankets, ammunition, things of that nature that, didn't have really any value compared with the large tract of land that they were giving up. And it was the largest land cession treaty in the history of the frontier up to that time. And the Cherokees relinquished their rights to that land, most of present-day Kentucky. And it wasn't just a local event of Kentucky history. It was a national event, because what that led to was the rapid increase of settlement beyond the borders of Virginia, which basically opened the gateway to the Old West, what we think of as the Old West and Western exploration, and the drive from sea to shining sea, so to speak. So it opened that gateway to Western exploration and colonization. That one treaty in 1775.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's safe to say that Richard Henderson was all about the money, wanting to get himself rich by making his own colony, and at one time he wanted to make it its own state. I mean, it's a whole mess of things that went on. Now, is there a historical site that you can visit for the Sycamore Shoals?
Yeah, there's a Sycamore Shoals Park there in Elizabethton, Tennessee, which you can attend, and see basically where the treaty was negotiated.
Hmm. Oh wow, that'd be a pretty good place to visit and see. One other thing. Well, anything else on that? I mean, that is a how. I mean, do we know how it got brought up? Like, I mean, was it just Boone went to him and said, "Hey, let's laying the groundwork for a treaty," or um, I assume Boone and Henderson approached them first.
Yeah, that's right. And it they approached chiefs Aconostota, Atakulakua, and oh, I'm trying to think of the third person. Sawanoka. Sawanoka.
Uh-huh.
He was familiar with their leadership, and it um, negotiated the treaty primarily with those three individuals who
Hmm.
were known leaders of the Cherokee Nation.
Do we know really? I mean, was it after the treaty was signed, after things, was there any remorse or buyer's regret, anything like that, as far as that
Yeah,
goes?
oh, absolutely, and that really was one of the things that led to the organization of the Chickamaugan
Oh,
faction.
yeah.
And Chief Doublehead was a part of that, and Chief Dragon Canoe and others were a part of the Chickamaugan faction, which basically rejected any rules or treaties that the white colonists wanted to offer. That they were basically nativists. They wanted to go back
Mhm.
to a time when they were independent of the European peoples
Influence.
and
Yeah.
their influences. And I should say too that the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals immediately led to the settlement of the three forts that we know that were that we've known of, all of our lives, Fort
Hmm.
Harrod and Boonesboro and Logan Station, which is located right there in Stanford.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, and that's, I mean, that is, you talked about it being such a impactful moment in not even Kentucky's history, but the nation's history. Because that I mean that would have changed everything. I mean, if the treaty doesn't happen, Boone doesn't come over and settle Boonesboro. Now Fort Harrod probably would have still been settled, but Benjamin Logan, he came through the Cumberland Gap too with Boone and Henderson.
And
Um,
William Whitley, Isaac
yeah, William
Sheldon,
Whitley. Yep. I mean,
and the Lincolns. The Lincolns
yep.
actually came over with the Bryans and the Boones.
Mhm.
The Bryans that we know of Bryan Station
Yep.
were really close friends with the Boones, and they actually were both from the Yadkin River Valley of North Carolina
Yep.
and relocated together to Kentucky.
Yeah. And, I mean that's massive. That's a big thing. If the treaty doesn't happen, it changes history, basically. But I guess that's what everything we talk about on this podcast. If something changed, it would have changed history. Um, so let's talk a little bit more. You mentioned Chief Doublehead. Um, what about him? What was his role? I mean, besides obviously the Chickamauga, what else was his big effect on the Cherokees?
Well, he was sort of a tragic national figure. A lot of people, you utter his name and they'll kind of laugh. Yeah, oh, Doublehead. That sounds like a
Mhm.
kind of a funny name.
Yeah.
And they gave him that name of Doublehead because the Europeans never knew how to take him. How he would respond to a treaty that was offered, or any kind of exchange.
Hmm.
And he was um, a man to be feared. He would hide out on the wilderness trail and he would attack. He would raid the settlements and so on. But at the same time, he dined with three presidents, you know, George
Wow.
Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, and was at least partly responsible for a lot of different land and peace treaties. So
Mhm.
he was a complicated person, but a tragic historical figure of national proportions because, you know, his life represented tragically our misunderstanding of the fact that Native Americans didn't have a concept of land ownership. And Native Americans held their lands in community with others in the community, and they grew their crops in uh, you know, with the community,
Yeah.
and they stored their grains and the food crops, and they were open and available to all of the community. And whoever had less, then you brought the crops, you know, the store of crops to them, and you made sure that everybody there in your village or community had, you know, had what they needed. And there wasn't any such thing as personal ownership of a house, for instance, or a plot of
Mhm.
ground, not like Europeans have. And so when Native Americans made these treaties, there were language barriers and you know, cultural barriers to understanding the differences in this concept of land ownership.
Mhm.
And so Doublehead figured into this because, you know, he represented the two sides of the coin of the treaty faction of in a lot of Native American communities, and the treaty faction that believed in trying to at least to make treaties or negotiations with Europeans, to sort of kick the can down the road and buy some time so that they would have, you know, have some land and have peace and quiet, and and you know, exchange for, you know, ceasefire of
Mhm.
war and hostilities. But yet, the other, you know, there was so much division between the
Mhm.
treaty faction and the Doublehead's understanding, for instance, that he felt like that he should make negotiations on his own, um, because he felt, you know, he took a more fatalistic approach, that he knew that there were so many Europeans that the land would be eventually taken anyway, so he might as well get something out of it.
Yeah.
And instead of um, you know, trying to make negotiations according to, you know, Cherokee law or
Mhm.
leadership.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's one thing. Like, the big question. I mean, basically, it was a cultural clash. The Native Americans did not understand or did not adhere to political boundaries. And having that personal ownership of land. That was not the case. It was like you said, a communal thing, and led to a lot of taking advantage of, or not being able to, like you said, communicate, or the understanding of a treaty, and which led down the road, to more treaties and so forth. Now, Chief Doublehead, was he? You mentioned him being with the Chickamauga. Um, was he the leader of that breakoff, or was there multiple people who said, "Let's go"?
There were multiple people, and Chief Dragon Canoe is probably the other most prominent member of the Chickamaugens that that you know, were basically fed up with the false treaties
Hmm.
being um, negotiated that were not lived up to, that were not not really honest treaties or honest negotiations with
Fair,
the
but yeah.
native. Yeah, they weren't fair in any way.
Or pretty interesting, and that's one thing I often like get frustrated with when I'm trying to like research history and so forth. It's like, there's just not as much about Native Americans as there is on the other side. And of course, you hear it all the time. History is written by the victor or whatever,
That's
and
right.
that's the thing, and that's one thing that frustrates me a bunch is because I would love to learn more, but it's just not as available. Um, and I would learn, like learning about each individual, these different chiefs and so forth, the people who had the impacts. Um, but it's just hard, it's hard, and there's of course, it's hard to find, um, information about a lot of people's ancestors. But that culture is such a different culture, and uh, you know, a lot of misconceptions, um, that's been taught for years, of course. Um, but things that I just wish there was more of that available. But we only have what we have. I guess that's where we're at.
Well, I think that there's a misconception that Kentucky doesn't have um, the the rich history that maybe other states have, like say North Carolina or New Mexico or Arizona, places where Native Americans, live there even now. And I think people have a misconception that because Kentucky is home to a thriving Native American community, and I'm not just talking about including people that have perhaps anecdotal evidence in their family. There's a lot of people in Kentucky who claim Native American ancestry, and they've heard stories or they've done genealogical research, and they've been able to come up with some kind of information that makes them feel like that they have Native American heritage, and they attend Native American festivals and powwows across Kentucky. There's a really um, you know um, popular powwow circuit across the state that people enjoy, and that sort of thing. But I'm not just including those folks who are important as well, but there are Native Americans, a lot of them that have located from other states, from Arizona, for instance, and Wisconsin. There's I'm uh, in touch, frequently in touch with Native American families because of my event organizing. Um, and I've organized four Indigenous Peoples Day festivals so far. I'll probably be organizing the Indigenous Peoples Day Festival in Louisville next year, um, and I hosted the first and second annual Indigenous Peoples Day Festival in Louisville, and the first one in Kentucky history in Stanford in 2017 at the historic courthouse. And KET did a program on it and so forth. But I just want people to be aware of the fact that there are a lot of Native Americans who still live here in Kentucky. Navajo, Lakota Sioux. There's a Mohawk family over in Berea, and the lady, she um, usually participates in the Indigenous Peoples Day festivals, and she's an amazing vocalist, really talented person, and she's a jeweler, um, and she's employed by the state to travel to schools across the state and tell school kids about her heritage and growing up as a Mohawk up in upstate New York. And I just want people to be aware that there are people, Native peoples, that call Kentucky their home. And this is a home to, many Native Americans. In fact, the census of 2020 indicated, according to the responses that they received, that 1.1% of all respondents consider themselves Native Americans. They responded in that fashion, and that doesn't sound like a whole lot, but considering that we had over 4,500,000 people in the state of Kentucky in 2020, then that accounts for about 50,000 people.
Yeah, that's a pretty good amount.
Yeah, that's quite a few Native Americans. And so I just want people to be aware of that this is a Native American state. It has a rich history, Native American history and culture, and that the Native community, is a thriving community, even now.
Yeah, yeah, and that's one thing, yeah, Native American uh, history and Kentucky history go side to side, or side by side. You can't open up a history book without reading, or at least a Kentucky history book without reading something with Native Americans in it as well. And like you said earlier about it opening the gate to the west, that Treaty of Sycamore Shoals, and it's very true, and that changed the path, that changed the outcome of many things, and Native American included. About how things went, and again, this is the Kentucky History Podcast, so we're going to talk about all parts of Kentucky history, and definitely the Native side of it needs to get just as much as attention as we can get to it.
Well, and then also, I would like to add too that a lot of people, a lot of Kentuckians feel very strongly about um, our, and feel very proud of our Native American history and culture.
Mhm.
Because back in 2017, when we passed, I helped Stanford City Council pass the first Indigenous Peoples Day proclamation. Then after that was done, then I canvassed the state the following year, and I was able to help local governments and not just large cities, but small cities as small as Livingston, Kentucky, and Liberty,
Hey.
and your Crab Orchard.
Yep.
We passed one in Somerset and London and Corbin, and I could name off. But anyway, we ended up passing an additional 22 proclamations in the state
Wow.
of Kentucky, uh, and that's more than any other state since the movement began in California in 1992. And that's something that we should really be proud of. That
Mhm.
we feel very strongly about our history and heritage here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky.
Well, yeah, I agree. I've always kind of I don't know of any Cherokee or Native American ancestors that I have. My mom did our family tree, many years ago, and I don't know of any. My grandma is unsure that one of her great grandmas may have had some Cherokee blood or some Native American blood in her, but none of that is confirmed. But I know there is a lot of people who claim that they do and have that connection. I've always, like I said before, I've always been so fascinated with the Native American culture, especially here in Kentucky. Um, but that probably, I think that wraps us up for now. Anything else you want to add before we go?
No, just to say that I don't have any Native American heritage that I'm aware of,
Mhm.
and I'm just involved with the activism because I just feel very strongly about it.
Mhm.
It's my passion, and I want to help um, to even if in a small way improve the lives of Native Americans who live here in the state of Kentucky.
Well, just again, the history of Kentucky definitely involves Native Americans, and we're going to try our best to get it out. Ms. Garner, I'll thank you again for coming on and joining us and talking about it. I've learned a lot. I hope that the audience has as well. Um, and you'll have to come back on, and we'll talk some more if we get the need to. It's good to hear from a fellow Lincoln County resident as well.
Absolutely. Well, it's just been a real pleasure to talk with you about this and talk about the marker there on Main Street. That's, it's the belongs to Lincoln County, and
Hmm.
it's something that we should all be proud of. That we have this, unique and rich history.
I agree. I agree very much. Well, thanks again for joining us, and thank you to everybody who listening, and we'll see you next time.